very much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Good. Let's go. So that's me, that's the Existential Academy that Jo was talking about, which is in West Hampstead. That's some of the team. These are some of the links you might want to follow up on. If you want to connect to me on Twitter, it's @Emmy Zen, and you're very welcome. These are the books that have my name on them so far, and of those, the latest one is a book I'm particularly proud of because it is complete teamwork with a team of 6 editors from across the world. This is the final word in 2019 on existential therapy, so look out for that. But today I'm not going to speak about existential therapy as such. I'm going to speak about what we have done with existential therapy to work with these world issues in the UK. So how can we do that, and how can we be equal to both the intimate emotions and feelings of individual people, whilst also understanding the political ideas and the crisis of meaning and truth that we're currently experiencing in the Western world? Well, that is, comes from this. We have criticized the Cartesian view for many years, and we have become postmodern, so we no longer think, therefore we are, but we have ended up with our post-truth era, which is about I believe and therefore I am right. And that, of course, is not the case. Truth exists. Human beings may not know much about the truth, and science may just be a stumbling effort to get little bits of the truth, which has to be constantly revised as we find out more things and we look at things from multiple perspectives. But nevertheless, what we look at, what we experience in the world, and what we study is all different aspects of something that is much, much greater than us, and that is just the way it is, and that is undoubtedly also something dynamic. So that is my personal assumption after being a philosopher for 47 years, that truth is my deepest value. At the end of the day, I measure everything by its truth value, and that is not the done thing at the moment. So, I'm going to look at how individuals get caught in meaning networks that may distort the meanings that they experience and that push them into functioning and looking at the world in ways that may become dysfunctional. So that is just as relevant, really, to why a person gets confused in their individual lives if pushed by, say, their family in a particular direction. But it also will tell us something about how peer groups, or for today particularly, the society, the state, and the current politics may influence people, or the culture and its ideology. Of course, I always have nature outside of that, which is why I believe that teaching people to go back into nature and go on the sea or on a lake or walk in a wood is by far the best thing to recalibrate when your meanings have become hijacked by a system that makes you lose track and gets you out of sync with truth. And for me, truth is all that is around this, all the whiteness, all the beyond all of these circles. So, for me, meaning is about all of our connections to the world. If you've read any of my work, you will know that I situate the world on 4 dimensions, following on from Binswanger, Heidegger particularly, lots of other people though. There is a great tradition for this quartering of the world in the Kabbalah, for instance, as well. We have the Jungian 4 functions. So the 4-part division works best in many ways because it balances us. There are 4 feet to a chair. There are 4 wheels on a car. If you only have 3, it works kind of. You know, it's like a tripod, but it's not quite as stable as if you have 4 legs to things. And also when you cut a cake, you start by 1 slice through the middle and then across, and you end up with 4 parts. So that is why I stick with the 4 parts of the world, and those are the physical, the social, the personal, and the spiritual. And of course, we usually, in existential phenomenology, use the German terms that are known through Heidegger and other people. So that's the Umwelt, the environment, the Mietwelt, the public world, the world with other people, the personal world, the Eigenwelt, your own world, your intimate world, and the spiritual world, the Überwelt, which is your relationship to the ideas. So at each of these levels, we relate to different things. So in the physical world, to things, here to people, here to ourselves, and here to ideas. And we do all of that all the time, and it is constantly, intricately interlinked and interwoven, so it's quite hard to track where somebody is in terms of their connections and their meaning making at all those different dimensions. So this is a diagram to kind of understand that. So you have your physical space, your spiritual space, your personal space, and your social space, but there are also areas where they overlap, and there's also places where they're all together. And of course, that again, that diagram doesn't do justice to the complexity, because our lives are really like complex sculptures. Now, don't go throwing the camera around. Come on. So that these kinds of overviews, I'm constantly playing with them. This is one of my diagrams that helps me remember where I am with a client at a particular time. So if you like, it's an existential phenomenological diagnostic framework. Where in the world does this person find themselves? This is what you were talking about earlier. What is my Befindlichkeit? Where do I find myself? Well, this helps me orientate myself. So what I've done here is the 4 world dimensions are on one side, and there are the 4 world dimensions at the top. So we end up with 4 quarters in each of the quarters. Here we have nature, the things, the body, the cosmos. Here society, other people, our ego, our culture. Here the person, the me, the self and consciousness. Here the infinite, ideas, spirit and conscience. And you can see lots of aspects of all of those dimensions as specified there. But much more importantly, from an existential philosophical point of view, one of the really core issues is that everything we do, every meaning we make in the middle of a tension between something that is positive, something that's negative, something that is white, something that is black. Everything comes in antinomies, in opposites, and everything has a range. So we can try to be on one side of the range or on the other side of the range, or we can learn to know the whole range and play with it and make it our own and not be afraid of the conflicts and the dilemmas and the opposites and the tensions, but actually have ownership of it. learn to work with it. So here are some of these oppositions that you will find. And again, it is a useful heuristic tool that helps us understand the kinds of troubles people are dealing with. So that's just the background. Now, let's see why it is important to have such a framework when we're going to work with the meanings that people experience. Well, it is because we are nothing but our connections, our meaningful connections to the world in all those different ways. And when we stop connecting, we die. And when we get disconnected, for some reason, it feels like we have died, or it feels like we're in danger, or it feels like a huge loss, because we've lost some of our connections. And the only way to overcome those things is to reconnect. So this is what we like to do. We love that feeling of experiencing how the different pieces of the puzzle of life fit together. And you see it in toddlers when they learn to do puzzles. That wonderful eureka moment when we say, yeah, it's finished, look, the pieces all fit together. That's a wonderful feeling. We feel connected. We feel eureka. We feel we own the world. So it's very satisfying. This is another way to think about it. To not think of it as a puzzle, but as a creative endeavor. So it's not that somebody has created the pieces of the puzzle and we need to work it out. It's that we can find different elements in the world and we find a way to weave those together. And that too feels very good, because it feels again like we can connect to the good things in life and choose to make them part of our connectivity and our strength. And the human brain is like this. It loves to create helpful patterns. It does that quite naturally. People feel much better when they feel affiliated to a group. That's why it's so nice to feel we think in like-minded ways, because then we know that we belong in this little group. We can do this with that little group. There are lots of ways in which we feel at home, because that is the feeling of being connected through the things that are meaningful to us. That is what we call our home. That's what we say. Where I hang my hat is my home. Where my homies are, where I'm with my friends, where I belong, that is where I am at home. Bear that in mind. On the contrary, we feel confused when we become disconnected. And is it any wonder that in this very disconnected world, people have embraced social media and other ways of mechanical connectivity to overcome that disconnection? It is a saving grace for many people to be able to be constantly connected like that. I am not minded to criticize people for constantly being on their phones, because they are busy figuring out who they are and what they want to be connected to in the world. What we do need to do is help them use that in a way that is constructive and creative rather than destructive and undermining, which it all too often is. This, by the way, is created from somebody's connections on Facebook. So this is the person, and these are the networks she has created. That is her network of meaning online, and it situates her at the center of a world that is meaningful to her. It's a bit like the universe, really. There's so many different stars and planets. It's utterly confusing and overwhelming. And you know, we're here somewhere in some tiny little part here that is our particular Milky Way and our solar system. There's too much of it. You can't even locate yourself properly in it. But somewhere we know that it all makes sense, although we don't know how. We don't know the truth of it, but we can sense there is some meaning to it that we do not yet fathom. The brain, of course, works exactly the same. All your different neurons are constantly connecting and making new synaptic connections, reorganizing things and creating this connectivity of meaning more and more. And you know, it helps enormously if you help your brain a bit with that. If you spend half an hour before you go to bed thinking through the day and asking yourself, what do you want to take from it and what do you want to let go? What do you want to connect more strongly to? And what do you want to change for the next day? And then when you go to sleep, your brain sorts it out for you. It's quite magical. And then you wake up in the morning and you start again. So, new learning also means undoing connections. It's not just about connecting. As Sartre said, every choice you make is also unchoosing something. When you choose to be a teacher, you're not going to be a milkman anymore. When you choose to be with one person, you're not going to be with all the other people anymore. There are, of course, ways in which you can vary that and change that and keep some sort of control over it. But at the end of the day, we need to commit. If we don't commit, we don't connect, there's no meaning. In total freedom, we have nothing. That is precisely what freedom is. It's to be disconnected and to still be able to choose. But if you're in freedom and you don't choose, you've got nothing. So that is a very important thing to remember. And when your connections are broken, it may sometimes really feel exactly like black holes inside of you. Because literally, those inner connections you've made and those brain connections you've made have been ripped out of you. And you literally are half dead or forlorn or lost with the loss you have suffered. That is how it works. So we can control this and we can replace some connections with others, but sometimes things happen to us that we didn't want to happen. It's called fate, or it's sometimes called society. It's wonderful when we feel in tune with our connections, because then we get easy meanings. We feel surrounded by positive meanings. We literally feel held like a baby in a cradle. But it is very rare. And when you have moments like that, you should completely go for it with that sense of flow and that sense of good mood, because we need to enjoy that. When connections are severed, we have strong emotional responses, and they can build up, and they can be like rivers that burst their banks, or they can be like, for Van Gogh, you might feel scorched by all of that loss and all of that emotion. And so I am a great believer in helping people to understand their emotions better and be equal to learn to tend that fire. Because suppressing feelings is absolutely not the right way forward. Because what are your emotions? They are the expression of your connections to the meaningful things in the world. That is exactly what they are. So we need to honor them instead of, like this, make ourselves live in self-forgetfulness, cold, and absenting ourselves, or even killing ourselves, as did Ophelia. We need to, as Kierkegaard said, learn that personhood is a synthesis of possibility and necessity. Now, it's a funny thing. In possibility, we have not yet connected to something we want. And in necessity, we need to take account of some reality that might either demand a sacrifice of us or that deprives us in some other way. And Kierkegaard's idea was that we have to learn to breathe with that. We inhale and exhale instead of thinking that it's all about holding on to the good connections and letting go of the bad ones. It's actually about going with the flow, up and down, breathing in and breathing out. Because all of our lives are about connecting and disconnecting all the time. So we need to learn to inhale, which is our anxiety, getting ready for something. And we need to exhale, which is our depression, letting go of something, losing something, if you like. So that is what it looks like. We want to go to a meaningful value. We get anxious, we want to achieve that. We lose a meaningful value, we go into desperation and to the loss. But then we become inspired again, and we have an aspiration and we go up to a new value again. So this is my compass of emotions, which is based on that idea. I don't have time to talk about it today, because that's just one of the tools. It is colored like this because the emotions fit on the spectrum exactly like the colors, and I've explained that many times, and so I won't go into it today, because today I want to focus on what happens when we experience existential crisis and we crash through all those emotions, whether we like it or not. When sudden upheavals or catastrophes endanger our whole life. And that can happen in so many ways. You can fall ill, you can be sacked from your job, you can be told that the person you love doesn't want to be with you anymore, or you can be told to go home and you can't live in your country anymore. And that is what has happened to 3.7 million EU citizens who lived in the UK. Now, just a little excursion into Jasper's view of limit situations, ultimate situations. He said, normally, we like to live as if everything is good and normal, and we forget that underneath there have been many struggles and problems to achieve that pretense, that bad faith, really, of everything being under control. I grew up with a great awareness of this because I was born quite soon after the end of the Second World War, and my parents spoke about the Second World War sufferings, where family members had been taken to concentration camps, to work camps, had been shot dead in the street, where my grandparents had lost their home twice, once through a bombing by the Germans in The Hague, then they moved to Arnhem, and then they got bombed out by the Brits and became refugees. They lost absolutely everything. I grew up with this constant awareness of their suffering. Could never forget that. That's very much at the core of me. And that is why I became I'm going to go over this, but it became very important to me to sit up and take notice when I realized what was happening in the UK. It really was as if suddenly everything was ripped away. Everything we took for granted was ripped away. And it felt as if we were no longer in a democracy. Simone de Beauvoir said something very wise about that. In her book, The Mandarin, she says, you can't lead a proper life in a society which isn't proper. In which every way you turn, you are always caught. You can't draw a straight line in a curved space. So there we are. This is what happened. In June 2016, we had a referendum on whether the UK was going to stay in the European Union. And this changed everything for EU 27 citizens in the UK, who weren't given a vote in the referendum, which was totally unfair. I had worked and lived in this country and paid tax in this country, remember? No taxation without representation, 40 years, and I wasn't given a voice in this referendum, which were going to decide about my very future. And the same applied to many other people. So for me, going back to my experience in the Netherlands and the Second World War, for me the European Union was, the meaning of it was peace in Europe, working together, making sure this dreadful thing never happens again. And this was very much true for many other EU 27 citizens who felt they completely lost their rights. They used to have full residence, they used to have voting rights in European elections and local elections, they had health care, they were able to bring family members into the country, they were able to come and go freely. It was very obvious, all of that was ripped away, straight away. So even with what is now called settled status, which we now are told we have to apply for, if you go out of the country for more than 5 years, it's gone. You can't bring family members in. It is a completely different situation. You have to apply to be allowed to stay in the home you have created. There are families being pulled apart because one of them can't stay. And the children, who are British, can stay. I have seen the most crazy, amazing situations. I have no idea how in the UK we were able to do this thing and suddenly change from decent human beings to human beings who thought nothing of simply turning 3.7 million people into second-class citizens. So there are lots of other problems with it. So people are getting deported as soon as they have a criminal record. I even know of people who've had a criminal record because of traffic offenses. They can no longer stay. If they're disabled, it is an even greater problem. If you've never worked because you were a carer or you were a mother, it's an even greater problem. It is absolutely unbelievable. But emotionally speaking, it's even worse. Because it's not just about not being able to vote anymore, it's about losing your identity. We European citizens in the UK were able to use our freedom of movement because we were Europeans. We weren't migrants. We were exercising our treaty rights. And so we felt European rather than, in my case, Dutch or French. I'd also had a French nationality, or British. I felt European. But ripping that away means you now have to choose. Where are you going to be? Who are you going to be? And for many people that choice has become impossible. So people feel disenfranchised and they feel afraid. This is very good. This is very close to how that feels, having that star that gave you your northern light turn away. And of course, we also know that this was achieved by people very cleverly manipulating meanings through memes, which are ways of using images to capture meaning in a nutshell. So these pictures where it said the UK was at breaking point because the refugees were going to flood the UK, so UK citizens weren't safe anymore, is completely based on lies. That's actually completely, totally untrue. And to say that the EU has failed us all is completely untrue too. These were just things that people were told and people believed and then blindly voted to leave the EU. You know, Cambridge Analytica sent messages to people that they had realized through Facebook particularly, but Twitter also, that they were sensitive to these kinds of fear-mongering messages. And we've been able to capture some of those messages, which most of us never saw, because we weren't selected for those messages. But these are the messages that made people vote to leave the EU. They are a distortion of truth. They are mendacious meanings that were based in fear-mongering. Project Fear instead of, on the other side, was on this side. So images about Islamic situations, border control, always extremely alarming, violent images. It's really quite unpleasant. So anyway, let me tell you how I responded to all of that. First, of course, I responded with despair and a sense of loss, and exactly the same way as all of us did, and a sense of being excluded and isolated and not being wanted anymore, being surplus to requirements, and then feeling angry about that and thinking, I'm not going to let that happen. So I applied for UK citizenship, and I was refused UK citizenship not once, but twice. And this was quite deliberate. It took me a year to fight that, but I won, and I now have dual nationality. And since I got that, I've been working for all the other people who are not in a position like I was to get dual nationality. So that's what Voices for Europe is about, to save our star and to overcome this. This is my colleague Helen de Cruz, who is, by the way, Belgium, and who has given up and who is now leaving for a post in the United States where she feels more welcome. I did some research with her as well, with 1,500 people, but this piece of research was based on how EU citizens felt. Soon after the referendum, they felt devastated, this incredible sense of loss, but also this betrayed. They felt betrayed because they had put their faith and their confidence in an environment that was meaningful to them, and that was suddenly changed on them. So I realized that so many people really went downhill. By being on social media, I became aware of several people who were suicidal, lots of people who wanted to leave the country in fear and despair. It was really quite terrible. So we created this service, an emotional service, support service for European. And we created that 2 years ago. But I also did other things. So I did lots of press interviews with the world press. This is one in the Nouvel Observateur in France. I went to rallies all over the place. I spoke at the Labour conference. I spoke at the big rallies in London. Lots of things. But the thing I want to talk about today is what we did with this ESSI service. So we've seen over 50 people, and it's all volunteers. It's a free service. So people can have, well, some have had a lot more than 12 sessions, but we say It's between 1 and 12 sessions. It's all European nationalities. We're doing an audit. We have a waiting list all the time. It's by phone and Skype, and we've also run some groups at the Existential Academy. But more than anything, what I've realized is that what helps people most is to actually start to do what I did, which is to become an activist in the face of all this despair and nonsense. You might notice here Digby and myself leading the march this is 2017, I think. We led a march with 750,000 people. It was quite scary to put my signature on the police document that said if something went wrong in this march, I was personally responsible. Quite weird. So, anyway, let's go across this. What people have asked me all the time when I get interviewed about this is, why do you use existential therapy? And the answer to that is multiple. It is, first of all, because these people have lost their sense of meaning. Everything has been destroyed in their life, and so what they need is to have a therapist who understands that and who can work with those meanings. And it's also very important that they have a therapist who isn't going to interpret their difficulties as if they are interpsychic difficulties that are linked in some ways to their own psychopathology, which is what journalists immediately expect. They immediately say to you, oh, but of course these are people who have pre-existing mental conditions and that's why it went wrong. No, the evidence is absolutely clear. These are people who were completely taken aback by a political event that changed a society and that put them on the back foot and that made it impossible for them to maintain their stability and their balance. And I think that this experience, which is a kind of dreadful social experiment, is proving what we have said in existential therapy for decades, which is that when people have mental health problems, there is always a situational thing. It's always about context, and it's always about how you are connected to the world. And you can't just work with the intrapsychic or the past or just the family relations. It's always bigger than that. So that is what we have been doing, using our philosophical methods, phenomenology, dialectics, meiotics, hermeneutic and heuristic methods. I will go over this, I will go over this, I will go over this. Sartre has been very useful because, of course, he was very much involved in politics too. So he understood very clearly how the personal and the social and the political are all intertwined, and how much in society is about the dominant group continuing to go on in bad faith, and in this particular case, literally being mendacious and telling things that are not true at the expense of other people. But he also said in his book, What is Literature, in 1950, that a lucid view of the darkest situation is already in itself an act of optimism. Indeed, it implies that this situation is thinkable. The moment when you've lost meaning like this and you're in a pickle, the moment you start describing it and creating the narrative of it, you begin to realize that something has happened to you. You may not be responsible for it, and you may be able not just to understand it, but to rise from it with more meaning and much greater understanding than you ever thought you were capable of. So that is very much what I hope for, that people will experience in that feeling of no longer being at home,
what Heidegger described as Unheimlichkeit, which he said is the essential way in which we all are. And Sartre said, we pretend certain things in order not to know that we are free and we're not actually at home, but we have to create our identity, we have to commit to things, we have to make our connections, and they can be severed. So that anxiety of the Unheimlichkeit may actually help people, and it may actually make them stronger and more individualized. And it is in communicating about that and in struggling not just on their own, but in the context of this political situation and with other people in that same situation, that they become individualized in a new way, that they discover that they have strength. And of course, we need to allow them to grieve as well, because the only cure for grief is to grieve. And you cannot expect people to just rise to the challenge. You need to go through this process of everything that has been lost before you do that. This is a diagram from a book I co-authored with Martin Adams that really, really sums it up, but unfortunately, no time for that. The summary of that is, though, that we do grow when we face challenges in truth, when we're not trying to do special pleading or victimize ourselves or say, the bastards, they shouldn't have done that to me, but you say, why did this happen? How did it happen? Why did it happen to me? Why now? How can I retrieve all of that, understand it, and actually give something back to society, for society to understand something about the pickle we're in and the plight we have created for ourselves. And so I believe that the European citizens have begun to become a force for the country. They have worked very hard over the past 3 years to work for understanding of all of this and to actually take something from it instead of just becoming a group of refugees who are in a ghetto of despair. So that is what is different this time around. The victims are fighting back, and they're understanding it, and they're trying to communicate what is happening to the other people who haven't quite woken up to just how horrible this stuff is and how unfair it is. So this is when we start working with time and the dialectic of time. Unfortunately, the dialectic of time has now brought us to the truth of our limitations, which always has to be faced, and the truth that it is very hard work to re-own your life when all your meanings have been unraveled. But that at the end of the day, re-owning your life is about recovering your capacity to be thankful for your very capacity for experiencing these things and your very capacity of you using your consciousness and your capacity for communication, connection, and meaning making to change something in the world for the better. And that is what we have to do. So what people have said is what has helped most in the clinic is to come out of isolation, to get perspective, to get things off your chest, to stop blaming yourself, to realizing your depression is actually oppression by the system, to find outside resources, to find internal resources, to have political engagement and activism instead of isolating yourself in a dark room and feeling sorry for yourself, to be online, to march, to build resilience. And that takes us back to Baumeister's wonderful work on meaning, which I've long used because it fits so nicely with my 4 dimension. These people all need to get their efficacy back in the physical world, their value back in the social world, which has completely been destroyed, their self-worth back in the personal domain, and their purpose back in the spiritual domain. And that purpose needs to be reformulated. It needs to be a bigger meaning than it was before. The old meaning was, just leave me be, this is my home, don't change things on me. The new meaning is, I've woken up from a dream. I am alive, I am awake, I understand what is happening in the world. I want to engage with it, and I want to play a role in finding a way to absorb it, transcend it, encompass it, and surpass my troubles through sheer hard work and understanding of the meanings I can mine out of all of that. Thank you very much.